Good evening. I'm David Attwell, and on behalf of the Modern School in the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York, a very warm welcome, and thank you for joining us. We are here for the annual Jacques Berthoud lecture, which has been a regular feature of the Modern School program since 2004. Jacques Berthoud was the head of our department for 17 years. We remember him for his collegiality, his flair, his erudition, his remarkable intellectual range, in which he was equally at home in the Renaissance, in modernism. He was a renowned scholar of Joseph Conrad, and in literary theory, amongst many other things. As head of department, Jacques helped to create an ethos of collegiality and creativity that remains a hallmark of English at York. He was a strong advocate of the foreign language requirement in the York degree, and this evening's lecture is very much in that tradition. Less well known is that Jacques grew up as the child of a French-speaking Swiss missionary family at Morija in Lesotho. English is widely used in Lesotho, and Jacques received his high schooling and undergraduate education in South Africa, in an English medium school and university. He began his academic career in English departments in South African universities before moving to Southampton and then to York. One of the languages he was exposed to in South Africa was, of course, Afrikaans. And that brings me to our speaker, Derek Attridge, who is going to address us on the subject of the Afrikaans language, some of its dialectal forms, and on Afrikaans literature. Derek is also a former head of department who built on the legacy that Jacques left. And Derek himself will say something about his particular relationship with Jacques shortly. Derek doesn't need much introduction to a York audience. Suffice to say that he is a scholar of world stature with particular interests in poetic language, in literary theory and philosophy, in modernist and contemporary fiction, notably James Joyce, and also J.M. Coetzee. His most recent monograph is The Experience of Poetry from Homer's Listeners to Shakespeare's Readers, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Derek Attridge, Minor Languages and the Question of Translation, or How I Learned to Love Afrikaans. Thank you.
When, as head of the York English department some 15 years ago, I proposed that the Modern Research School institute an annual lecture in honor of Jacques Berthoud, I had no inkling that one day I'd be invited to deliver it myself. My thanks go to Erica Sheen and to the Modern School for the invitation and for setting up this event on Zoom. Of course, it ought to have been actual rather than virtual. It ought to have been a year ago, and it would have been the warm-up act for a day-long celebration of the work and career of David Attwell. That celebration will now take the form of an online roundtable tomorrow at the same time, and let's hope that David can be there. C'est dommage, as Jacques might have said, but there's always a silver lining. I'm glad that some far-flung friends have been able to join in this afternoon. I'll come to Jacques in a moment, but I'd like to start with a bit of autobiography. I'll also start with a bit of screen sharing. As a white schoolboy in South Africa in the 1950s and early 60s, I was required to study two languages, English and Afrikaans. The majority language around me in Natal was isiZulu, but this was not a school subject, and all I picked up from our Zulu servants was the patois known as Fanagalo. The languages spoken by the large Indian population remained completely closed to me. My parents were of British descent, and I don't think I ever heard them attempt to speak Afrikaans, I'm pretty sure their grasp of the language was minimal. The town in which I completed my schooling, Pietermaritzburg, had, in spite of its founding by voortrekkers in 1838 and its resultant Afrikaans name, Pietermaritzburg, had relatively few Afrikaans speakers. When the British took over in 1843, the voortrekkers moved on. Afrikaans was my least favorite subject at school. This was undoubtedly because the language was associated with the government at the time, which was busy enforcing apartheid throughout the country and within the white population, promoting the interests of Afrikaners. At university, I studied German and French, delighted that I no longer had to sit through Afrikaans lessons. If pressed, however, I'd have been forced to admit that I had enjoyed some of the Afrikaans poems I'd studied in school, such as Eugene Marais' Winternacht, an extract from N.P. van Wyk Louw's epic poem Raka, and a sonnet by Peter Bloem called Oor Monumente Gepraat, speaking of monuments. The image here shows two of the contents pages of my school copy of the Afrikaans poet D.J. Opperman's Groot Verse book, great book of poems, which I bought in 1961 and for some reason still have. This anthology of poetry in Afrikaans, first published in 1951, was immensely influential in establishing a canon, and it still exists in much revised form, most recently edited by the late Andre Brunk. In 1966, I left South Africa to study at Cambridge, and what small place Afrikaans had occupied in my intellectual and cultural life disappeared altogether. But in the country's history, the language was to play a major role. The beginning of the end of apartheid occurred in 1976 when Black school children protested at being forced to learn through the medium of Afrikaans, and the protest grew into an uprising that spread throughout the country. In the last decade of the century, what had seemed impossible in the 1960s came about, the relinquishing of white rule and the institution of majority government. South Africa now had 11 official languages rather than just 2, and Afrikaans metamorphosed from the language favored by those in power to one that was under threat of extinction. My own sense of Afrikaans changed too. No longer wanting to keep it at arm's length, I became interested in its remarkable treasure house of literary writing. Of course, my Afrikaans, learned under those unpropitious circumstances, was never terribly good, and what knowledge I had once possessed had grown very rusty. So at first I continued to rely on English translations. But 2 spells at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study, Stellenbosch being the home of Afrikaans, have improved my grasp of the language and helped me to enjoy its literature more directly. To go back to my time at the University of Natal, the BA degree in South Africa comprises a number of subjects, and I was at first uncertain which I would specialize in for my 4th year honors degree and perhaps beyond. It was largely the teaching of one lecturer that lay behind my choice of English over the other subjects I was taking. Jacques Berthoud stood out among the English department staff for his intellectual sharpness, breadth of knowledge, infectious enthusiasms, and captivating Swiss-French accent. Born in Switzerland, he'd been transplanted to Basutoland, now Lesotho, at the age of 3, and for his secondary education was sent to Maritzburg College, the same school at which I was to struggle with Afrikaans some 10 years later. Did he enjoy Afrikaans lessons more than I did? I can't say, but there's plenty of evidence that he took Afrikaans writing seriously. He seems to have followed a subsidiary course in Afrikaans at university in Johannesburg, and he co-authored a book on the Afrikaans writer, Ace Krige, published in 1966. In the course of a biographical account of Krige in this book, he provides a potted history of the Afrikaans language. The library he brought to England when he moved here in 1967 included several books in Afrikaans, especially poetry. He probably sustained his reading ability in the language, but was never a fluent speaker. His family report that he and his wife Astrid spoke Afrikaans only when they didn't want the children to understand. So the only one of the trio of South African heads of the York department who's at home in Afrikaans is the missing David Attwell. Oh, I think David might be back. Hi, David. David has never, to my knowledge, published on Afrikaans writing, but he could well do so. His many years in South Africa, and particularly his time teaching at the University of the Western Cape, where he's now extraordinary professor, will have inculcated a deep familiarity with the language. What then are the salient features of this language? Afrikaans descends from the Dutch of the original colonial power in South Africa. The first ships arrived at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652, but bears the traces of a number of other languages into which the Dutch speakers came into contact, including the indigenous languages of the Khoisan people and those of slaves imported from South and Southeast Asia and the Portuguese African colonies. Beginning in the 18th century, a relatively stable version of this linguistic mixture gradually emerged, derived from the simplified version of Dutch used by the slaves amongst themselves or in communicating with the indigenous peoples and in exchanges with their masters. The first examples of written Afrikaans are in Arabic script. Large numbers of the slaves were Muslim, and Arabic Afrikaans was used by imams at least from the early 19th century. Let me end my screen sharing for a moment. For a long time, this Cape Dutch was stigmatized as an inferior dialect associated with non-white racial groups and among whites with poverty and poor education. But a sufficient number of white speakers felt that the language was part of their identity to facilitate a movement to recognize it as a language distinct from Dutch, and this became a political project in the 19th century. In 1875, the Genootschap van Rechte Afrikaners, or Fellowship of True Africans, was established and set to work creating the dictionaries and grammars needed to constitute the new way of speaking and writing as a language in its own right. Formal recognition was achieved with the passing of the Official Languages of the Union Act of 1925, according to which Dutch was to be understood as including Afrikaans. Eventually, the 1961 Constitution of the newly declared Republic of South Africa demoted Dutch and made Afrikaans one of the two official languages alongside English. Part of the unacknowledged rationale for the project of establishing a true Afrikaans was the fact that the language spoken by the white descendants of European immigrants was worryingly close to the language spoken by the people known in South Africa as coloureds, many of them the descendants of slave women impregnated by their Dutch-speaking masters. Because white Afrikaners spoke in a manner that had much in common with the way these other, and for them inferior, South Africans did, they had to institute and safeguard their own way of speaking as a pure language spoken by white people, sharply differentiated from the similar language spoken by those who were not white. The Afrikaans Taalkommissie, Language Commission of the Akademie vir Wetenskap en Kuns, Academy for Science and Arts, chose Oosgrens Afrikaans, Eastern Border Afrikaans, the language of the Boer republics, in preference to this Kaapse Afrikaans, Cape Afrikaans, and Oranje Rivier Afrikaans, Orange River Afrikaans, which was influenced more strongly by the indigenous Khoi languages. What this history shows clearly is what is called the Standard Afrikaans. Standard Afrikaans is the result of a political project and exists only because of the success of this project, a success not unrelated to the winning of political power by its white speakers in 1948. But it's far from an unusual history. Very few standardized languages in the world have arisen without some degree of political and often military power being involved. Whenever you hear of a standard language accompanied by dialects, you can be sure that there's a history of power relations. The saying, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, captures nicely the political and hegemonic determinations at work. But what it also shows is that Afrikaans, before it was the language of the powerful, was the language of the underdog. It was what the Boers, in their struggle against British imperial domination, spoke To champion Afrikaans after 1902 was to honor the memory of the thousands of Boer women and children who died in the British concentration camps during the South African War. The promoters of Afrikaans saw themselves as undertaking the same endeavor as the proponents of other languages under threat from a dominant power, such as Flemish, Irish, and Welsh. Although Afrikaans became in turn the language of the dominators, its historic association with the struggle for liberty never entirely disappeared, and many Afrikaner intellectuals joined the fight against apartheid. As Hein Willemse, a leading colored academic in South Africa, has said, Afrikaans bears the imprint of a fierce tradition of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, of an all-embracing humanism, and anti-apartheid activism. Afrikaans is spoken as a first language by around 7 or 8 million people. It's thus one of the world's many minor languages. To publish a novel in Afrikaans is to limit your readership to a small number, almost all of them in a single country. To publish a literary novel or a collection of poems is to limit it to an even smaller number. Most Afrikaans writers are also fully at home in English, so their choice of medium says something about the language's significance for them, a significance that may be connected to its history of contest and embattlement, a history now repeating itself as English becomes more and more the language of politics and education in South Africa, having always been the language of finance. For one of the world's youngest languages, it has a distinguished roll call of literary writers, from the poets of the 1930s, known as the Dertigers, who explored the potential of the young language, including two of those whose poems I enjoyed as a boy, Van Wyk Louw and Marais, to the radical writers of the 1960s, the Zestigers, far more adventurous in their formal experimentation and subject matter than equivalent writing in English, and to the important achievements of Afrikaans fiction in recent decades, from the pens of Ingrid Winterbach, Etienne van Heerden, Marleen van Niekerk, S.J. Naudé, and many others. However, it's only to be expected that writers should value a global rather than a purely local audience, hence the importance of translation, especially translation into English. Leading Afrikaans writers have varied in their approach to English translation. Some have written versions of their work in both languages, the most famous being André Brunk. Others include Naudé, Dominique Botha, and Tom Dreyer. Some work closely with translators, a prime example being Marleen van Niekerk's collaboration with Leon de Kock on Triumph and with Michiel Heinz on Achat. Etienne van Heerden also revises his translator's drafts and has the benefit of detailed comments by his agent in this country. And we can see an example of their work here. This is a page, a typical page, of the typescript of Van Heerden's novel In Love's Place, the translation by de Kock of In Steede van die Liefde, with comments by Van Heerden himself and by Dixon. So you can see on the left is the translation that de Kock produced, and then Van Heerden has gone through and queried a number of his decisions, and Isabel has chimed in with her own thoughts about the particular word or the particular phrase being used. Other Afrikaans writers leave it to the translator. I don't have any reason to think, for instance, that Wilma Stockenstroom collaborated with J.M. Coetzee when he translated her novel, in English, The Expedition to the Baobab Tree. Of course, some works lend themselves more to Englishing than others. The crime fiction of Dion Meyer is as page-turning in English as it is in Afrikaans, while the Joycean linguistic exuberance of Van Heerden's 30 Nachten in Amsterdam, 30 Nights in Amsterdam, posed a massive challenge to the translator, Heinz again. Van Niekerk's Triumph, about a foul-mouthed, dysfunctional, incestuous family of poor Afrikaners in the run-up to the democratic elections of 1994, relies so much on untranslatable Afrikaans expletives that the author agreed to 2 English versions by de Kock, one for South African readers retaining much of the Afrikaans, which most South Africans would understand, and one for the international market, substituting, I think not very successfully, English exclamations. One variety of Afrikaans poses exceptional problems for the translator into English. I need to return to the history of Afrikaans to explain these. I mentioned earlier that the project for a pure Afrikaans took as one of its major tasks the drawing of a sharp line between the standard language and what was regarded as an inferior dialect spoken by the colored peoples of the Cape. One characteristic of this Kaapse Afrikaans is that it draws freely on English vocabulary, giving it a distinctive lexical character in combination with a distinctive pronunciation. The Academy protecting the white version of Afrikaans, on the other hand, emphasized the language's Dutch origins and saw Anglicisms as a contamination. The wheel has now turned, however, and it's the speakers of the so-called dialect who are campaigning for its recognition as a language, often referred to as Afrikaans or just Kaaps, on an equal footing with the so-called standard Afrikaans. Kaaps lacks an academy, let alone an army and a navy, but it's beginning to reveal its potential as a literary language. There's no standard form of Kaaps. Different speakers will use more or less English, for example, and do so for different purposes and in different situations. The version spoken, for instance, by the Muslim community, known as Cape Malays, has its own distinctive character. Here's the trailer for Barakat, a new film centered on this community.
Aisha Davids, sal jy met my trou?
Aisha, wat? Sy weet ek is 'n pensionaar. Wat word jy nou opgeskep as 'n mansmens op jou ou dag? Toe lê nog lou warm in sy graf.
Nou lekker! Ja, jy is vroeg, ja.
Wat het die boys te sê oor Albertus? Hulle Pietie, ek het 'n plan. Ek gaan ons almal oorkry vir hulle warm en dan gaan ek die nuus vir hulle breek, maar op 'n mooi manier.
Wag. Wat gaat hier aan?
Sy's engaged.
Wat?
Wag nou. Kan ek net my moment enjoy kan hulle?
Ek wil so 'n bietjie stil staan deur te praat oor Barakat. Mommy doesn't know what she's doing. It's love. It's not love. Says who?
He's a nice man.
Ek gee nie om nie.
Sal jy at least try om hom te leer ken?
Wie is Abu Talib in die Koran?
Mohammed se oom.
Wat is die 9de maand van die jaar?
Ramadan.
What is the call to pray?
Adan.
Sy is welkom hier. Ons het 'n pa gehad en sy sal nooit onvisie.
Pa so baie disappointed gewees het, so I kasam.
Daai vrou sit altyd ander mense se happiness vir haar eie. En ek sorry so nie, maar ek kan nie meer daai vrou visie. If I didn't love Zaid so much, it wouldn't be long gone.
Just because your park wife sits on your head, you think you can treat us all like puppies, huh?
Yes, kyk wat ek nou Then also not tell you eating after the backyard. I'm starting to feel like the black sheep. Noor gets to stay here. Mommy strikes sy onderbroekies.
Dan bring jou onderbroekies.
Maar hy is die ding van families. Almal vol of hulle woord.
Kyk hoe klou ek. Klou? Dis nie klou nie, hy is menopause. Sy sweet Aisha.
A related mode of speech is the Tsotsitaal of the Gauteng townships, in which Afrikaans and English vocabulary is mixed with indigenous languages such as isiZulu and Setswana. One might think, and many in South Africa did and perhaps still do think, that these so-called dialects are spoken by fewer people than Afrikaans proper, but the reverse is the case. Some 60% of Afrikaans speakers would have been classified under apartheid as non-white, and most of those speak a version of the language other than the standard, although the better educated are able to use that standard version whenever necessary. In a replay of the struggle to establish Afrikaans in the 19th century, activists in the coloured community are encouraging the use of Kaaps in education and publication. Clearly, the positing of a distinct language with its own name is an important weapon in the struggle to acknowledge the speech habits of this section of the population as having equal worth with the other recognized languages, which is of course also a struggle to gain respect for the culture of this community. For instance, there's a move to acknowledge Kaaps in schools, where traditionally only standard Afrikaans was taught. There's an echo here of the campaign to recognize African American English, sometimes called Ebonics, in American schools. And there have been no doubt similar campaigns elsewhere on behalf of sometimes language versions branded as dialects. The history of Caribbean English in South Africa, in British schools, is an interesting point of comparison. One of the leading writers in Kaaps, Nathan Trantral, to whom I will return, comments sardonically on the situation in a short text titled Skryf het soos jy praat, write it as you speak. Asked as a boy in his Afrikaans class to write about a day that I will never forget, he's reluctant to give an honest answer, an honest account of the violence and psychological abuse that mark his most vivid memories, so he lets his imagination take over to recount a perfect day at the beach. And he explains that if you fail Afrikaans in this system, you fail the entire year, even if you pass all the other subjects. Want Afrikaans is jou huistaal, what of course ironic was. Want Afrikaans was nie ons huistaal nie. In fact, die Afrikaans wat ons op skool gedoen het net 'n passing resemblance gehad to die Afrikaans wat ons by die huis gepraat het. Because Afrikaans is your home language, which of course was ironic because Afrikaans wasn't our home language. In fact, the Afrikaans that we did at school had only a passing resemblance to the Afrikaans that we spoke at home. When Trantral much later finds himself teaching Afrikaans at his old high school, his class is stunned and baffled when he asks them to write an essay as they speak. As was the case with white Afrikaans, writers of literary works using Kaaps, which is primarily a spoken language without a fixed orthography, have played and will continue to play a crucial role in securing for their tongue the prestige and stability that it needs. A lone pioneer in using the language of the colored community for literary purposes was Adam Small, who died in 2016 at the age of 79. But recent years have seen a burgeoning of writing in Kaaps. Trantral and his wife Ronelda Kamfer are among the most important of these writers. They've published 3 collections of poems each, and Trantral is also the author of a collection of stories, and with his brother Andre, several graphic novels. These are Nathan Trantral's novels and a collection of pieces, and Ronelda Kamfer has published 3 books of poems. 2 other writers who are championing Kaaps by example are Olivia M. Coetzee and Chase Reese. Coetzee is undertaking a translation of parts of the Bible into Kaaps, and in 2019 she published a novel, In His Shadows. There it is. Her variety of Kaaps uses relatively few English words, its distinctiveness lying primarily in the choice of vocabulary and the pronunciation of Afrikaans words. Reese's novel Kinders, or Kinders, Children, appeared in 2018, and the endorsement on the cover, which you may be able to read, is as follows: a character study van kinders in die war zone van die Cape Flats, maar ook veel meer. Baie funny and intensely moving. Not surprisingly, perhaps, this endorsement is by Nathan Trantral. Recent additions to the growing body of poetry in versions of Kaaps are Ashwin Arendse's Swartland, in which Arendse uses an Arabic symbol to represent the characteristic R sound of the Malmesbury area, where R is pronounced R rather than R, and Ryan Pedro's Pink Ceramic Hoinkies. Discovering this writing prompted me to go back to one of those Afrikaans poems I'd enjoyed at school, Peter Blum's Oor Monumente gepraat. Only now understanding that Blum was a dissident white Afrikaner who, in this poem, appropriated for comic purposes the language of Kaaps. Knowing this, I can no longer enjoy the poem without certain inner reservation, but its irreverence towards the colonialist statues in South Africa has a certain resonance today. At the foot of Table Mountain, Cecil Rhodes no longer "Jou wys waar die reisiesbaan lê," shows you where the race course lies. I'd like to read in my imperfect Afrikaans and even more imperfect Kaap's one of Transvaal's shorter poems in order to return to the question of translation. Part of the pleasure in reading poetry like this, when you're familiar with the accent, is finding how the spelling, which looks at first very strange, produces the appropriate version of the words in your mouth. Some in the audience may remember a book that did something similar with Australian pronunciation. You have to read these phrases in an Australian accent, and then they suddenly make sense. But here is Transvaal's poem. Woensdag, 16 Februarie 1988. Ek is nog klein. Ek staan alleen in die agterjaard by my ouma hulle huis en ek voel sad, omdat ek weet vandag is 'n boring, unimportant dag. Ek weet die dag het niks gedoen wat het worthy maak om onthou te word nie. Ek voel sad, omdat ek weet daar was al duisende dae soos die wat ek al klaar vergiet het. 'n Mens kyk terug op jou liewe en die goed wat uitstaan. Daai is vir jou, jou liewe. Maar daai is die liewe nie. Daai is die highlights reel. Jou liewe is 'n klomp dae wat niks gebeur nie. Ek stap na die wasgoed wat op die lyn hang. Ek sit my hand teen 'n nat handdoek en ek dink ek gaan nooit die dag vergiet nie. If poetry like this is going to be appreciated beyond a very narrow circle and its value registered by speakers of other languages, it needs to be translated. But how are we going to translate this poem for an Anglophone readership without losing the distinctive place the original occupies somewhere between two official languages? There's no version of English that I know of that could capture a similar use of the words in a different language. And no way the difference in cultural prestige between the two languages could be replicated. I suspect it would be difficult in any language. In the following version, I've simply translated the non-English words into English and left the English words as they are. Wednesday, the 16th of February, 1988. I am still little. I stand alone in the backyard of my grandma and them's house, and I feel sad because I know today is a boring, unimportant day. I know the day has done nothing that makes it worth remembering. I feel sad because I know there have already been thousands of days like this one that I have already completely forgotten. A person looks back on your life and the things that stand out. That, for you, is your life. But that isn't life. That is the highlights reel. Your life is a bunch of days when nothing happens. I walk to the washing hanging on the line and put my hand against a wet towel, and I think I'm never going to forget this day. You'll have recognized the connection between this poem and the prose text I cited earlier. Here's Transvaal's essay for his teacher on a day I will never forget. Not the violence and psychological abuse that characterized many of the days he remembers, and there's no shortage of these in his poem, but a day that's memorable precisely because he's grappled with its unmemorability. The hints of an impoverished childhood, which are much stronger in many of Transvaal's other poems, the boredom, the lack of stimulation as he hangs about in his grandmother's backyard, the washing on the line, contribute to the value of the discovery at the end of the poem. And the sensory vividness of that wet towel, the arbitrariness of which contributes to the poem's realism at this point, is part of the child's experience of unexpected significance. But the losses in this translation are great. There's none of the colloquial tang that suggests a particular environment, social class, and, this being South Africa, racial community. Part of the reason for Transvaal's success in his native country is his challenge to the pieties of Afrikaner linguistic purism. For white Cape Townians to see the language they hear on the street every day, given the status of print in a poetry collection, constitutes for many a surprise. pleasant or unpleasant. And for colored readers of poetry, it's an affirmation of the value of their discourse and culture. Trantral is on record as complaining that Adam Small used the language largely for comic purposes, and although he himself does the same in many of his poems, this example shows how it can be a medium for something that may be light in tone, but has real depth. And of course, the translation loses entirely the sense of an in-between way of speaking, neither fully Afrikaans nor English, and it can't avail itself of the resource constituted by the availability of two vocabularies with different connotations to draw from. Let's stop for a moment. The usual term for this linguistic practice is code switching, but it's a term I resist for the same reason that I find myself resisting the description of the colored peoples of South Africa as mixed race. It authorizes the model of the world's language as separate and self-enclosed entities, just as mixed race implies the existence of distinct, pure races. The reality in both cases is of a continuum, separateness and purity being ideological impositions by those with the power to enforce these views. A more useful term for the linguistic phenomenon I'm discussing here has more recently been adopted by some language theorists: translanguaging. It's not the most elegant word imaginable, but it offers an alternative to the concept of code switching. According to the code switching model, a speaker of Kaaps, for instance, has internalized two separate language systems, Afrikaans and English, and draws on one or other of them at any given moment, switching freely between them. According to the translanguaging model, such a speaker is using only one linguistic system, a system that includes vocabulary and grammatical structures conventionally regarded as belonging to both Afrikaans and English, which are names for other linguistic systems that have been crystallized through social and political processes. As many linguists have pointed out, the named languages of the world are not linguistic entities, but socio-cultural ones. We shouldn't hesitate to call Kaaps a language then, even though the circumstances under which it's developed mean that there's wider variation among speakers, and perhaps for any given speaker from one occasion to another, than is usually the case in the so-called standard languages. Whether we think in terms of code switching or translanguaging, Kaaps, as exemplified by this poem and by Trantral's work more generally, foregrounds the question of untranslatability. The conventional model of translation, the transfer of meaning from language A to language B, simply does not work. This means that in choosing to write in Kaaps rather than in standard Afrikaans, Trantral and others deny themselves a wider readership to an even greater degree than writers who use the latter language. The existence of languages like Kaaps clearly has consequences for any notion of world literature that relies on translation. David Damrosch's famous or notorious statement comes to mind. World literature, he claimed, is literature that gains in translation. Are we to consign to oblivion all those works honoring speech practices that fall between standard languages, of which there are many, as far as any conception of world literature is concerned? My preference would be to expand the notion of translation so that it includes a variety of ways of conveying the experience of the original, wherever possible, allowing the reader to engage, at least to some degree, with that original. Translation, instead of being conceived as the transfer of meaning from one language into a different language, would become an open field of varied practices, including literal translation, explanation, and suggested equivalence, with the recognition that readers' differing idiolects will result in different strategies, having differing chances of success in different contexts. Stefan Helgeson suggests that the process of retranslation, quote, contributes to establish not a text, but an expandable, multilingual textual zone, issuing from multiple subjectivities produced in discrete systems of publication and constituting thereby the effective world literary existence of a poem or a novel, end of quote. This approach would mean, in cases like Trantral's poetry, dropping the implicit requirement that the translation be roughly the same length as the original and exploiting to the full whatever elements of the original are available to the reader of the translated version. In What is World Literature, Damrosch discusses 3 translations of Murakami Shikibu's Book of Genji, pointing out that the increasing number of notes in successive translations significantly enriches the reading experience. And he quotes André Lefebvre as follows. When we no longer translate Chinese tongue poetry as if it were imagist blank verse, which it manifestly is not, we shall begin to understand tongue poetry on its own terms. This means, however, that we shall have to tell the readers of our translations what tongue poetry is really like by means of introductions, the detailed analysis of selected text, and such. Several East Asian languages make use of special characters known as ruby to add information using a smaller font above or side by side with the main text. And this is a useful device for translators wishing to expand on or clarify their choice of words. The Japanese translation of J.M. Coetzee's Moral Tales by Nozomi Kubota illustrates the use of ruby characters. Here's a page from her translation of the story The Glass Abattoir. I'm going to zoom in on the ruby characters so that you can see them more clearly. Kubota has not gone for the obvious Japanese translation of the word behavior, but has chosen a Japanese word whose more common meaning is movement or action. In order to clarify the sense at this point, she's added ruby characters that spell out the English word behavior in katakana, one of the Japanese syllabic alphabets. So the little characters there, if you do know English, and of course you would have to know English in order to appreciate what is happening here, you sound out the katakana characters and realize that the meaning of the Japanese word is not movement or action, but behavior. As well as clarifying meaning, ruby characters can be used to show the pronunciation of unusual words. One can imagine a similar technique being used more widely in translation to elucidate or complicate the meanings conveyed by the main text. Jacques Derrida has argued that, quote, nothing is untranslatable if only one gives oneself the time necessary for the expenditure or expansion of a competent discourse measuring up to the power of the original. He urges the renunciation of the ideal of an economic equivalence, that is, the traditional demand that the translated work be close to the original in length. We now have relatively new tools at our disposal in getting to grips with writing in a language with which we're not familiar, including online translation tools and dictionaries, easily accessible background information, and text-to-speech and speech-to-text applications. Translation understood in this way would be seen less as a matter of producing an equivalent text in another language and more as working with the original to find ways of enabling access to it. The virtues of partial comprehension of the original, in contrast to complete comprehension of a translation, would be acknowledged. Translation would be understood as an unending process. Barbara Cassin, who edited the remarkable Dictionary of Untranslatables, defines the untranslatable term as one which we never stop translating, and I'm happy to use the adjective in this sense. In the case of the Tantral poem, rather than simply translating the Afrikaans into English and leaving the English as it is, as I did earlier, one might present the original text alongside the translation and add a commentary on its special qualities. Take lines 2 and 3, for instance. Ek staan alleen in die agterjaard by my ouma hulle huis en ek voel sad. I'm standing alone in the backyard at my grandma and them's house and I feel sad. I'm feeling sad. The original and the translation could be accompanied by a note on the pronunciation of Kaaps as distinct from standard Afrikaans, such as alleen for alleen, inni for indi, and huis for huis, and the use of agterjaard for backyard instead of the more usual agterplaas, suggesting here the influence of English. The English word sad would be highlighted, in contrast to the Afrikaans words that might have been used, all of them somewhat more refined, hartseer, treurig, droevig. zwaarmoedig. It would be worth pointing out that Afrikaans verbs have no progressive aspect, so ek staan and ek voel could be translated either as I am standing or I stand, I am feeling or I feel. The original doesn't have the slightly poetic feeling that I stand and I feel possess in English. What would be especially valuable would be a link to a sound recording of the poem read by a speaker of Kaaps. Introducing the poem to English-speaking readers would thus be to some extent also a lesson in varieties of Afrikaans. In this way, the apparently untranslatable work of a poet like Trantral could be made available beyond the narrow limits of the readership of Kaaps. Such an expansion of the notion of translation shouldn't be confined to works in non-standard languages. If we recognize the artificiality of the standard named languages, we're free to experiment across traditional boundaries in seeking to create an experience for new readers that's to some degree similar to that of the original readers. Most literary works draw on a range of linguistic usages, implying, for those familiar with them, differences in class, age, location, profession, and so on. And a sense of that range is an important part of the experience of the reader. Finding an equivalent for that range in another linguistic habitat by means of traditional translation is a significant challenge. Other techniques are required. Moreover, different genres require different strategies. The line-by-line commentary I suggested for a short poem isn't going to work for a long novel. There's also merit in translations written for those who are at home in the language of the original. Clive Scott has written several books exploring this possibility, where the point is not to make a work in another language available, but to use translation to investigate the qualities of the original. This question of the cultural implications of the original is one that's posed by all translation. The more distant the culture of the writer, the more the reader has to intuit or find out in order to appreciate the meaning. Here again, translation may work best if it's not thought of as the transfer of a set of meanings encoded in the words of one language into the words of another, but as an attempt to create, by whatever means appropriate, an experience that corresponds in some measure to the experience of a reader who's able to enjoy the original directly. We can go further. Reading virtually any literary work involves some cultural distance and perhaps some linguistic distance as well, even if it's in a language one knows intimately. Hence the value of annotations of various kinds, including modern translations of words that have changed their meaning over time. There'll always be variations in the needs of different readers. Every reader brings a singular idioculture, the particular combination of knowledge, habits, prejudices, skills, assumptions, goals, and so on, imbibed from the circumambient culture, to the practice of reading a literary work, whether in a familiar or an unfamiliar language. Over time, this array changes as a result of further experiences, including further reading. To misquote Heraclitus, you can never read the same poem twice. Reading cultures more broadly change too. Lefebvre, presenting an argument that translations refract rather than reflect the original, wrote in 1982, quote, "Standards have changed so often in the history of Western literature that it must be obvious by now that translations are good only with respect to a certain place and a certain time in certain circumstances," end of quote. The experience of reading a work in translation, then, is different only in degree from the reading of works in a language in which one is competent. Most accounts of the practice of reading, I'm thinking, for instance, of the studies that go under the name reader response theory, as well as the phenomenological tradition, underestimate, to my mind, the complexity of response of which the literary reader is capable. To read well is to bring to bear on a text as much of your idioculture as is relevant, which involves a constant process of trial and error. It's to keep in play your awareness that the work you're engaging with is the product of an individual's creative labor. It's to allow a role to whatever knowledge you possess about the original context within which the work was written. It's to recall, where appropriate, other works by this author, or works from the same period, or works in the same genre, and it's to rate all this to the needs and values of your own time. To read a translated work is not substantially different. You're aware of the creative labor of two individuals, it's true, but then many works in their original language bear the traces of more than one author. As Kate Briggs puts it in This Little Art, her wonderful meditation on the art of translation from the point of view of the practitioner, in reading a translation as a translation, we establish a relationship with two creative projects. Mrs. Briggs, not either or, but holding and maintaining a relation with both writers, a sense of both writing practices in their shared project and in all the important ways those projects differ, in the head and somehow together. Of course, if you're unaware that you're reading a translation, the experience is no different from reading an original work, and there are commercial reasons for the attempt to create this illusion for readers. It's worth emphasizing that translation, like all forms of commentary, quotation, or reinscription, is one element in the ongoing process that keeps literary works alive. The singularity of the work is not threatened, but is constituted by translation. Translation into the idiolectal and idiocultural frameworks of readers, into the words of commentators, into other literary forms, and into other languages and cultures. What would Jacques Berthoud have made of this argument? He wouldn't simply have accepted it, of that I'm certain. He would have probed and challenged, demanded clarification or amplification, and added his own insights. Just to imagine his response is to sharpen one's self-criticism and reinforce one's commitment to the highest intellectual standards. This, too, is part of his lasting legacy. Thank you.
A very rich reflection on Afrikaans and its various forms, as well as reflections on translation between regional and minor languages and the languages of what has come to be called world literature. There's much food for thought for us there. And if you do want to respond, it should be possible to do so in the Q&A function on your screen, and I will try to summarize if necessary and convey your responses to Derek in the course of discussion, if that's how things develop. One of the things about Jacques that I didn't know until Derek's lecture was that he had co-authored a book on the remarkable Afrikaans writer Ys Krige. I'm in the fortunate position of having been entrusted by Jacques' family with his South African books, which I have brought back to South Africa with me, on the understanding that I will make sure that they make their way to a suitable South African library. And having seen the cover of Jacques' book on Krige, I went into this library and I discovered several of Ys Krige's books that had belonged to Jacques. And one of them is a collection of French surrealist poetry that he translated, Krige translated into Afrikaans. Krige was an avid translator, as well as being a novelist and poet himself. He translated from the Portuguese, from Spanish, Lorca in particular, and also from French. One of those books is a collection of the poetry of Paul Eluard. And I thought that while Derek catches his breath, I would read a short poem from Jacques' copy of Eluard's poetry, but as translated by Ys Krige. The poem is called Die Aarde is Blauw, from Eluard's title La Terre est Bleue. The first line in French is La Terre est bleue comme un orange. So the earth is blue like an orange, this being surrealism. I don't have time to read it in English and in French, so I'm only going to read the Afrikaans. If you have some German, if you have some Dutch, you might be able to follow. Die aarde is blauw soos 'n lemoen. Nooit 'n fout die woorde lieg nie. Hulle kan ons nie meer fluis nie. Nou moet die soene mekaar verstaan. Die gekkes en die liefdes, sy met haar verwante mond, alle geheime, alle laggies, en wat 'n gewade van toegewendheid om haar naken te verbeel. Die wespe bloei groen, die daraad glip om sy nek, 'n snoer vensters, vlerke oorvleuel die blare. Jy het al die sonnevreugdes, alle sonskyn op aarde, op die paaie van jou skoonheid. Paul Elward in Afrikaans. Derek, to kick off the discussion, I thought I would ask you this question and invite you to reflect on it. I would guess that a number of us are wondering whether the success of CARPS, which you demonstrated so admirably in the lecture, whether that success is due to the fact that we do read it in conjunction with the standard version of the language. You talked about translanguaging, not quite the same as code switching, but we are aware that we're moving between different registers when we listen to CARPS. It does come from an oppositional position, if I can put it that way. So do you think then that in time, CARPS will become a fully autonomous literary language in its own right?
Thanks, David. It's a good question. I don't have a crystal ball to know how successful the campaign to make CARPS a language in its own right will be. I suspect not for a long time. There are very interesting debates, as you know, going on about even standard Afrikaans, which is now under threat in many ways. So whether CARPS can do better than standard Afrikaans, it's possible. But I think part of the issue here is whether, if that were to happen, would it lose its power? Do we enjoy it precisely because it's oppositional, because we can sense that this is an upstart language challenging the hegemonic Afrikaans that we've been rammed down many of our throats rather resentfully. And I don't know. I think it's important to realize, as I know you do, that different readers, different communities will read the poems very differently. Speakers of CARPS reading a poem in CARPS will not read it the same way as you or I, and I guess someone who's even more deeply immersed in Afrikaans than you would also read it differently. But for all, I suppose, it currently has that status of the upstart. And if that were to disappear, I guess the poems would have to stand on their own 2 feet a little more. And no doubt the best of them would survive and the weaker poems would go the way of all weak poems. You're still muted, David.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the Q&A to see if there are questions coming in. There is certainly a question here from Rita Barnard. You may certainly ask a question, Rita. I think you're going to have to put it into the Q&A, and I will convey it to Derek, though. So I'll come back to you shortly when you've had a chance to do that. Derek, I just wanted to say as well that your reflections on translation between these languages, but also your reflections have much more general application as well, are so appropriate, coming from a department that Jacques helped to shape, which has always endeavored to think across languages. The position we've always taken in the department is that we think it makes a difference to one's work in English, to one's reading in English, if you're able to to listen across different languages. That's a position that the York Department has always embraced. And your lecture is certainly completely within that tradition, and we appreciate it on those terms as well. Let me go back to the Q&A now. Lots of commendations coming in and lots of thanks.
I want to know what Rita has to say. Rita, who is an Afrikaner after all.
Here we are. I shall, says Rita. I wonder if Derek could reflect on the language of Junot Diaz's brief wondrous life of Oscar Wilde. How does one translate into Spanish? What Diaz creates is something rather like carbs, inseparable from a certain irreverence. It is NJ, not Spanish. Derek, are you able, have I given you enough to be able to?
Yeah, yes, sure. As I said, there are many examples around the world of this kind of translanguaging, and in fact, there are some interesting articles written by, I think maybe Puerto Rican linguists about the way versions of Spanish interact with English. And Junot Diaz's novel is wonderfully exemplary of that. I mean, it's a very hard-hitting novel in its content, but I think its use of as it were, again, an underdog language is very much part of its force. So yes, I think all over the world there are these ways of speaking that have been called dialects and kept out of the literary pantheon, as it were, that are now making their claims. And I'm sure people can think of other examples in other parts of the world. As I mentioned, Caribbean English in this country, in England, has, I would say, the same potential. It's also been put down in education as, inferior. Kids had to learn proper English, and as a result was sent, often sent to special schools because they did not speak a proper language. They only spoke this dialect. So yeah, so it's a global phenomenon.
Thank you, Derek. That's very helpful. And of course, Rita has helpfully alerted me to the fact that she was referring to New Jersey. I needn't have read that out as NJ. Thank you, Rita. There's a question from Vani Capildeo at York. Thank you for an illuminating discussion. Do you have any favorite examples of creative, innovative, resistant translation between any languages or modes not cited so far? So any favorite examples of creative, innovative, or resistant translation not cited so far? So translation that works against the grain of the original. I think that's the spirit of the question.
Well, I mean, there are many examples of translators who avowedly don't translate but produce versions, Don Patterson and Machado, for instance. I'm trying to think of examples of what I was proposing. I'm sure there must be some, which is to say a translation that doesn't try to produce a word for word or meaning for meaning equivalent, but actually plays around with various aspects of the language in order to convey to the reader who doesn't know the language some of its force. I think the answer is no, I can't. I wonder if she can think of any. Or anybody can think of any.
Perhaps, Vani, you could come back to us on that.
I'll keep thinking. Give
an example of your own. Let me go back to the Q&A. there is a question from Peter MacDonald. Thank you, Peter. Karps raises questions about literary translation as a deliberate act, process, etc. What does it say about translation as an ordinary, everyday part of the life of all languages?
Thank you, Peter. Yes, I mean, I was talking deliberately about the literary sphere, since we're a Department of English and Related Literature, but when I was talking about the way my comments about translation are appropriate for all kinds of reading, because all reading is in effect a transmigration from the language and cultural resonances of the author via a text to a reader. I think I was getting at the same thing that you're getting at, which is that we're never far from translation. You know, you're never more than 7 feet from a spider, they say, and I think you're never more than an inch from translation, because this process of moving across not just languages, but versions of language, cultural sedimentations within language, we're always sliding, slithering, jumping around a huge and complex container that is our linguistic brain, if you like.
Thank you, Derek. There's a question from Marius Swart. Derek, I agree strongly with your points on the fact that the stronger poems would stick around and the weaker ones would fall by the wayside as the non-standard varieties of Afrikaans become more prominent. Don't you think this could already happen now, as soon as they are translated? The uniqueness is probably greatly reduced when translating them into, for example, English. This was a significant challenge for me with Die Sneeuwslaper, for example, retaining the interplay between different varieties of language and between Afrikaans and Dutch, where this interplay does not similarly exist in English. I hope, Marius, I've been able to get the force of your question. Derek, do you want me to read it again, or are you happy?
Well, hello, Marius. I'm glad you're there. What's the force of the question? Can you summarize, David, what you think Marius is getting at?
Let me try again. So the question has to do with the fact that stronger poems would stick around and the weaker ones would fall by the wayside as the non-standard varieties of Afrikaans become more prominent. I think that's key. Don't you think this could already happen as soon as they are translated? So the uniqueness is greatly reduced when translating them, for example, into English. This was a significant challenge for me with Die Sneeuwslaper, for example.
Okay, yeah.
Yep. Okay.
I've read Marius's translation of Die Sneeuwslaper, so I know he did a great job. But the question of the stronger poems surviving now and the weaker ones falling out, well, yes, I guess that's so. I just interrogate my own enjoyment of this poetry. I find every poem I read I enjoy just because it's so fresh in its handling of language. But as I keep reading, I'm sure some poems, well, the one I chose to talk about in the lecture, some poems will come back to me, some poems I will want to reread. So yes, I think Marius, you're right. There will be a winnowing, but in order for that to happen, it can only happen if some technique of translation is made available rather than just turning it all into English, in which case I think none of them work just in pure English, but also none of them would work if you just translated them back into standard Afrikaans. They only work fully as these translanguaging poems, and that's what has to be conveyed to a non-Afrikaans speaking or non-English and Afrikaans speaking readership.
Yes. And you did make the point in the lecture, I think you were quoting Stefan Helgeson at the time, that the translation ought to be accompanied by some kind of account in which there's reflection on the processes at work. That would be in an academic environment anyway, that would make it possible to capture some of the complexity, the negotiation that we're reaching for here. Vani Kapildeo came back and she says, thanks so much, first of all. And then she adds, Zoe Scolding's translation network produced some interesting stuff in recent years. Okay. And a point of information. And then Peter MacDonald comes back and says, yes, what about Merotra's translations of Kabir? Very interesting there. An anonymous attendee, Derek, asks, what are your reflections on translations of novels, especially in the light of the notion of cultural untranslatability? It's a large question, of course.
Yeah. What are my thoughts? I have written about what I call cultural distance, which I would argue, again, what I've said already, is always there. It's only to a matter of degree whether I read a novel written in English 20 years ago in this country, or I'm reading a translation of a novel written 100 years ago in Hindi. Yes, there are different experiences, but there's some degree of translation at work all the time. I think what we have to accept is that we can never, and we should never even think we're trying to put ourselves back into the mind of the writer. It's not reading literature is not an attempt to fight our way through the language and get to some pure meaning that would be
yes,
culturally and intellectually the right meaning. We're working in a field, as Stefan Helgeson says, a textual field. So constantly we're changing ourselves as readers, and therefore the texts themselves are changing. So there are clearly challenges when the culture which has produced the novel we're reading is one that's very different from ours, either historically or geographically, or both. But we should go on, we should keep doing what we can to overcome those barriers without setting up false expectations or a false model of what the perfect reading would be. Novels are very rich entities, and if we get half of what a novel has to offer, we're still getting a great deal.
Thank you, Derek. Questions are piling in. There is a question on Joyce, but I think I'm going to skip to the questions at foreground Afrikaans, so we keep provenance, because otherwise I think it's going to take us into a 2-hour seminar just on Joyce himself. The question is very interesting, of course, and it's about what Finnegan's Wake would have to say about translanguaging and world literature as translatable and translated literature. What does it mean to translate it? That is a question that certainly would certainly keep us busy for a long time. There's a question here from David Moore-Brown. Thank you, Derek. To what extent do you think the upstart nature of camps is a linguistic reaction to the political hegemony of the apartheid nationalists, rather than a natural drift towards the colloquial? And if so, might it with time move back towards the standard as the historical embarrassment fades? Did you get that? You want me to go?
Yes, I did. Yes, thank you, David. That's a nice, okay. Nice question. Yes, nicely put. Well, there's no doubt that the resource here is colloquial language. so poets writing in Kaaps are drawing on the language of the street, basically, and there's a fine old tradition of poets rejuvenating the canon by turning to the language they hear in the streets around them. Again, I don't want to predict what would happen, but surely there's no danger that the language on the street will drift back towards the standard Afrikaans. I mean, if anything, English is becoming more dominant in South Africa. So I would have thought perhaps the reverse is true, that maybe the Afrikaans the Afrikaans element in Kaaps will give way to more and more English.
Could be strengthened. Yeah.
Yeah.
Michelle Kelly asks a question. Thanks for a wonderful lecture. I have a question about the logic of the kind of expansive translation that you've described and the technologies that might allow it to happen. Do you have anything more to say about this? So it's about the expansive translation I alluded to earlier. I think you were quoting Stefan Helderson about this at one point, and the technologies that might allow this to happen. It struck me that there are certain, this is Michelle Kelly speaking again, there are certain resonances between translation and remediation and the possibilities that various technologies open up. There are varieties of book that one can imagine, but sound, and indeed sound, image, and text, as the trailer from Barakat showed, seems central.
That's it.
That's it.
Okay.
So it's, yeah.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm forgetting the beginning of your question now.
She was focusing on expansive translation.
Yeah.
What she calls expansive, and the technologies that might allow
technologies. Yes.
One, sound and image and text, in addition to whatever textual work might have to be done.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the question of what technology. I was talking about the technologies that can help the process of understanding text in another language. I was thinking partly of how I managed to read pretty well J.M. Coetzee's latest novel, which appeared in Spanish, and my Spanish isn't great, but with the help of Google Translate, I was able to get through it reasonably well, as I say. So there are technologies there. You can put your phone over a text in one language and see another language, which is something we couldn't have imagined 10 years ago. 20 years ago anyway. But then Michelle is raising the multimediality of many art forms, which of course then again raises huge problems. How do you translate a work that is visual, oral, and textual at the same time?
Yes.
Fortunately, at least it seems fortunate, it seems easy to translate, or that you don't need to translate the visual and the oral if it's, a question of music. Of course, the same processes are at work when we see those images of the Cape Malay population. We don't see them with the same eyes as local inhabitants of that community do. So so there is a need for annotation, for explanation, for finding ways of bringing home to the reader who doesn't, or the listener or the viewer who doesn't possess the intimate knowledge that is embedded in those works. So finding a way of making those available to the outsider, as it were.
Yeah, thank you. Andrew van der Vlies asks a question. Thank you, Andrew. He writes, thanks for a stimulating paper, Derek. Your translation of Tramtal's poem attempted to voice it in a standard version of English. And incidentally, let me just say, I thought that was a fascinating exercise. And one will want to use that kind of exercise in a seminar environment and get people working on other examples. I lost my Q&A briefly there as I was enthusing, but I'm going back to it. Here we are. What would the politics be of attempting this in a non-standard version? You can get the drift of Andrew's question. A subtext to my question is the difficulty and danger of staging the voice as comic. There is a long tradition of Afrikaans or something like it under the white gaze as an object of humor, even derision, unfortunately. That's my annotation to Andrew's question. He goes on, we might even cite Andrew Geddes Bain's Kaitji Kekelbeck from the 1830s here, which of course was a white representation of a certain kind of Afrikaans that the author Bain was supposedly hearing in the settler colony at that time. How is this navigated in translation? Any thoughts on this particular issue in South Africa would be interesting.
Yeah, you touch on a very tricky point, Andrew. Thank you for the question. Was one reason why I raised the sonnet by Peter Bloem that I enjoyed as a schoolboy, and then only later discovered. I had carried in my head the idea it was by Adam Small, who was, as I said, the colored pioneer really of writing in Kaap, and it turns out to be by a white Afrikaner. He was a good guy. He was a dissident Afrikaner. He was very much against apartheid and against the system, but still, he was writing, as you say, the white gaze, finding Kaaps funny, and I'm very conscious of my own the dangers that await my own enjoyment of this poetry, because it sounds funny. It's this wonderful mixture of English and Afrikaans, and it does tap into that whole South African tradition of the comic Cape Coloured, unfortunately. And Transvaal certainly is trying to resist that, but I don't think he always does, and it's a challenge, I think, for white readers to enjoy, but to be aware of the dangers of that kind of enjoyment, which is inappropriate and politically and ethically suspect.
And in fact, one of the poems you dealt with in the lecture, given the seriousness of thought in it, the existential frankness of that poem, which is about the ordinariness of a particular day, I mean, that in itself would go a long way towards alerting a reader to the problematic politics of the situation. So there's a question here from, it seems appropriate to jump to this question because it picks up some of the issues, from Lindelwa Delamba. She says, I know this is an English department gig and the ink on my PhD has barely dried. Nevertheless, may I ask two questions? Of course. First, what kinds of dangers might this kind of argument pose for South Africa dealing with the conservative Afrikaner cohort emboldened by Trumpism, AfriForum, etc. in recent years? I ask this because the beginning of the narrative was firmly rooted in the political, something that has not receded. Second, as a Xhosa speaker, how may the contours of this argument energize intra-African languages in South Africa, where English may not be central? Fanagalo and Tsotsitaal were mentioned. The two rich and quite challenging questions, Derek.
Great. Well, to take the second one first. Okay. I think this is absolutely the way one would hope South Africans' extraordinarily rich array of languages would go, and I see no reason why English should always be part of the mix. I mean, I mentioned Tsotsitaal, which was really the Sophiatown street language, and which had a lot of Afrikaans. But the languages now, I gather, in Gauteng, in the townships, for instance, are more a mix of Setswana, what am I saying? Setswana, Zulu, obviously bits of English, because English is fairly inescapable. But I'm sure there are other versions which are much less beholden to English vocabulary. So, and I would hope that there might be possibilities of literary works written in other trans-language examples from other parts of the country. Now I've forgotten the first half of about the political Afrikaner. Yeah, well, this is exactly what I think writers like Tantral and Kamfer are opposing, the notion of a white Afrikaans that goes along with yearning for a white homeland and such things.
Yes.
So
yes.
I think, yeah, you talked, David, about the oppositionality of this work, and I think that's exactly what it's opposing.
Thank you, Derek. A question from Hugh Horton. Derek, I'm grateful for your critique of linguistic purism of all kinds. I wonder whether translation that involves linguistic contamination, foreignization rather than domestication, in Venuti's terms, is particularly important for you in this respect. I'm thinking of Faustina's great translation of Celan's Todescu that uses increasing amounts of German as it goes on. I hope my pronunciation is intelligible.
Yeah.
Hugh writes Todesfuge. There was a spelling mistake.
Yes, Todesfuge.
Todes. Yes. Okay. Thank you. We got there.
Yeah. I have an open mind about foreignization. I can see that if Random House wants to sell translations, they better make them easily readable by the thousands who they hope to buy their books, and not studded with words that they can't understand. On the other hand, aside from commercial reasons, I think the field of translation allows for a huge variety in degrees of foreignization. I think it's good that one should be made aware that one's reading a translation. One shouldn't be made uncomfortable. Well, maybe one should be made uncomfortable. One should still enjoy the thing, because if it becomes too much of a struggle, one's going to put it down. But it's one way of keeping alive some of the qualities of the original. But of course, many writers of ostensibly English novels, and I think more and more in recent decades, throw in words in other languages and don't bother to translate. And in fact, South African writers, I think that the strategy of having a glossary at the back of the book where all those Zulu and Afrikaans words are translated is disappearing, because now, does it matter if you can't pick up this or that foreign word in the text you're reading? So yeah, I think these are important developments.
John Birtwistle asks a question. In what ways would the comprehensive translation you propose differ from traditional exegesis, such as a school-glossed text in Latin? Would it not be another power relation, he asks, enthroning the exegetical class? What happens to the physical qualities, rhythm, music, and so forth, lost in such translation?
Thank you, John. I think the second half of your question to some extent answers the first. If you're simply talking about an authoritative second voice telling you how to read the first voice or how to understand the first voice, then you are stuck in a not very happy power relation. But if you're using, as Michelle was saying, all the available technologies, if you're, I mean, even in Latin, one can imagine a Latin text which was studied with, if it was online anyway, studied with little audio and video examples, which gave you alternatives rather than simply laying down the law about what this word means or what that phrase means. There'd be all sorts of ways in which the once authoritative voice of the exegete would be replaced by a multi-voiced and multidimensional way, giving the reader much more choice in which direction to follow. I mean, again, the advent of online and computer-aided reading is a great resource here.
Thank you very much. Rick de Villiers asks a question. If I'm not mistaken, Rick will be in Bloemfontein. But he has a connection with Durham, so there's a northeast link there as well. Derek, a wonderful talk, thank you. My question is, can you tie Coetzee's Jesus trilogy? So let me read this again. My question, can you tie Coetzee's Jesus trilogy and its apparent English/hidden Spanish to your broader discussion of translation? Have these books shaped your thinking on this topic in particular ways? I happen to know they have, Derek, which is why I'm thinking this question.
Yes, they have. Yes, there's a whole other discussion to be had about reading novels in language A, where the protagonists are supposed to be speaking language B, and the way the writer signals this. So Coetzee will spatter the odd Spanish word into texts of those books to remind us that we are to understand that these people are speaking Spanish. But of course, it's just a convention. Why should half a dozen words in a chapter be in Spanish? Why not all of them? Well, we wouldn't understand it unless we understood Spanish. So it's a little trick of the writer just to keep us on our toes. But it certainly did make me think more about the notion of I don't know what to call it, the language that's supposed to be the supposed language that's not actually there. And again, well, as we know, the Spanish translations, and in the case of the third one, the translation came out before the original, lose that sense of between two languages, because everything's in Spanish. So those little words that stand out in the English are gone. And maybe that, there is that rather clumsy translator's device where you say in Spanish in the original in brackets after the word. But maybe we do need something like that in order, in order for the Spanish version to keep the little folk. Why does he choose those certain words to put into Spanish rather than to leave them in English?
Thanks very much. I'm going to move towards a close by bringing out some of the questions that have to do with York and its specific traditions and its engagements with South African material. Daryl Jones asks a question from Trinity College in Dublin, but he says a proud graduate of York's English department and a former student of Jacques Berthoud. How nice, Daryl, to have you with us. As embodied by Derek and David, there's a long history of connections between the University of York and South African intellectuals. Is that happenstance, the people who happen to be employed at various times, or is there something more historically planned and deliberate? Derek, I think it'd be nice if you took this one.
Well, I think we should ask Hugh to step in here, because
that's a good idea.
To the early days of the department, I mean, I first became aware of the York department as a student in South Africa when it was, I don't know, about 3 years old, because the the link already existed, and my slightly older fellow students were going to York to do their PhDs under Bob Jones, for instance, who had been at Pietermaritzburg and had moved to York. So I don't know the intricacies of that argument, but it goes right back to the beginnings of the York department. There was a strong connection between South African universities, and University of Natal in particular, and York.
Yes, and Bob Jones was certainly partly instrumental in that, as of course was Jacques. Just let me add to your anecdote. When I found myself in the department that had been, in the office that had been Jacques and then yours, I was delighted to find on the shelves MA and PhD dissertations that had been written by some of my former lecturers back at the University of Natal.
Yeah.
That was a lot of fun. Elike Boma writes, thanks, Derek. Enjoyed that immensely, as well as I responded to that at the level of language. I loved how you wove your own story and Jacques into your talk. This picks up the same theme. To jump to the question, how much is criticism a form of life writing? How much is criticism a form of life writing? Thanks. Or becomes more so as we go along, she adds.
Well, it was our friend John Coetzee who said, all writing is autobiography. So yes, it becomes more explicitly so, doesn't it, Elike, as we go on. I would never have written a piece like this, in my 20s. I was following the strict rules of the academic paper, and I wouldn't have dreamed of bringing in my own individual experience. I'm glad I feel able to now, because I think when one pretends it's all kind of neutral voice from nowhere, when one is actually being deceptive, one is pretending something that doesn't happen, because one is always writing out of one's own experience.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Just on the South African question again, and Daryl's question, it is important, of course, that York created the Center for Southern African Studies, if you recall, during the apartheid years. And that was an interdisciplinary project that brought together people in sociology, political science, English, and some other departments. And that was an attraction, often for South African exiles, but also for South Africans who wanted to go abroad and get and study South Africa in a progressive environment. That certainly happened a great deal. And one of those people might be lurking in the background of this conversation, Michael Green, who had that experience, who came and worked with Jacques, but also with Landig White in the center. I came to realize that York was intensely involved in Southern African studies through a conference and subsequently a very influential collection of essays on South African literature put together by Tim Cousins and Landig White, in fact. It was a landmark conference on South African literature, and it certainly energized debate at the time. I'm talking about the 1980s, I think. But of course, I also became aware that at some point it became mandatory in the York department that if you were going to be head of department, you had to come from Pietermaritzburg. That happened. That why that exactly developed, I'm not sure. But by the time I got there, that was a rule.
Yep.
Carol Clarkson asks an interesting question. We're going back into linguistic things here, but it's a long and interesting question, and I feel I should read it. Baie dankie, Derek. Geluk. I especially appreciate your attentiveness to different varieties of Afrikaans. This made me question the concept of monolingualism. Are we not always translanguaging? Is it possible to be monolingual even when we think we are speaking the same language? Is it possible to be monolingual even when we think we're speaking the same language? Even the first monolingual dictionaries occasioned by loan words in the language, ! A more specific question about Afrikaans and Dutch in relation to English. Dutch and Afrikaans both have a smaller vocabulary than English, and yet Dutch and Afrikaans seem to operate very differently when translated from and into English. I wonder whether you have any thoughts about this. So are we not always translanguaging? Even, I think Carol means in ordinary conversation. And then a second question about the nexus of Dutch and Afrikaans and English, where there are different dynamics involved as we translate between those two languages because of the word stock being so different. Do you want to take any of that up?
Just to say, yes, I agree with the first claim that, and I would only be echoing Derrida, in fact, to say there's no such thing as a monolingual speaker or writer. We are all multilingual. But the second question, I don't think I can answer because I'm not that familiar with English translations of Dutch. Well, I read some novels and I've written a little about W.G. Hermans and the question of translating Hermans, which is an interesting one, but he's a very unusual writer, maybe. So no, I'm sure the nexus between Dutch and Afrikaans must be very different from that between English and Afrikaans because of the, never mind the question of word stock, the overlap between those two languages. So I'd be very interested to know what it's like for a Dutch speaker to read Afrikaans, and B, what is entailed in producing a Dutch translation of Afrikaans when the languages have so many similarities. But I wait to be enlightened.
Yes, and I'm sure Carol will be able to enlighten us on that subject.
We certainly would.
The right context. I think, friends and colleagues, I should draw things to a close. In South Africa, it's 5 to 8. In the UK, 5 to 6. We've been going for almost 2 hours. It's been an extraordinary, warm-hearted, as well as collegial and entertaining, but also searching discussion. And that, of course, is very much thanks to Derek and the kind of tone you've managed to establish. Derek, we really appreciate that. So thank you to all. Thank you to Derek in particular. Thank you to Erica Sheen as Director of the Modern School for orchestrating all of this. And thank you one and all to those who are here with us, all the participants. And thank you also for your questions in the Q&A. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much and good night.
Thank you.